Genesis chapter 17. Let me read this to you this morning. Abraham's 99 years old. Verse 1. When Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty, walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you, and that you may multiply you greatly. Then Abraham fell on his face, and God said to him, Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and the kings shall come from you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you. And I will give to you and your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. And God said to Abraham, As for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. And this is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. You think God wants him to keep the covenant? Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall circumcise in the flesh of the foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised, every male throughout your generations, whether born in your house or bought with your money from any foreigner who is not of your offspring. Both he and who is born of your house and he who is bought with your money shall surely be circumcised. So shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. Abraham just got a new name. We go from Abram and Sarai, and later here in the chapter, God gives Sarai a new name of Sarah. So we go from Abram and Sarai to Abraham and Sarah. God is speaking to Abraham as he has before, and he says, I am the God Almighty. As he talks to Abraham, he says, I am the God Almighty, or I am El Shaddai, Almighty, all-sufficient, the protector, the powerful. In the 91st Psalm, it says, He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. This idea, as God is talking to Abraham, he says, I am God Almighty. I am your shelter, Abraham. I am the one that covers you. I am the one that guides you. I am the one that protects you. I am the Almighty. You can dwell underneath my wings. You can live underneath my protection. And Abraham understood that he was talking to God Almighty, the one who was protecting him, the one who had called him out from the land from where he was, had brought him into a new land, had taken him and said, I promise I will give you this land of Canaan. So what else can Abraham do but trust him? He's obeyed him. He's believed him. He's had moments of doubt, but he has believed and he's been faithful. And we're told in the New Testament how it was credited to him as righteousness. He was faithful. But Abraham is 99. And he's still waiting on the promise. How many know waiting stretches our faith? How many of you like to wait in line? How many of you like to wait at one of those lights, those four-way lights that just seems like it takes forever to turn green? How many of you go and like waiting at the DMV? Maybe the post office. Waiting in line to eat somewhere. There's just something about waiting that just I don't like. It feels like a waste of time, doesn't it? You think as you sit there and you're waiting, you think, I could be doing anything except waiting here. Isn't there something else I can do? There's a better use of my time than just to sit here and wait. It's wasteful. And yet God is having Abraham wait. How many of you have ever waited on God? Say, Lord, where are you? I'm wasting my time here, God. I need to hear from you. I need an answer from you. You made me a promise. When are you going to fulfill that promise in my life? See, in Genesis 12, Abraham was 75 years old when he first heard from God. 75. When God spoke to Abraham and he received this call to leave his country, this promise of being a great nation, of being a blessing, and making his name great, he was 75 years old before he received his call. So some of you that aren't yet 75, there's still hope. God can yet call you. You know, the truth is there's never a time in our life when God stops using us. I don't know that there's a time or an age in which we get where we retire from God's will and purpose for our life. 75 in Genesis 12. In Genesis 16, we find out that Abraham is 86 when he has a child with Hagar, his wife's servant. That season of doubt that they went through, Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, the promise is yet to be fulfilled. Years pass again until Genesis 17 when we find out that now Abraham is 99 years old. At this point, Abraham is beginning to think maybe Ishmael that he had with the servant Hagar must be the one in which God is going to fulfill. After all, he's been waiting all of this time. How come he's still waiting? What Abraham began to learn, and what you and I can learn this morning, is that waiting stretches your faith. And our faith can only grow, and our faith can only be confirmed, and our faith can only grow greater when it is being stretched and pulled and worked. Faith is like a muscle. Muscles can atrophy. If you don't use those muscles over time, they begin to weaken. They begin to get smaller. That's why they have astronauts in space, and they try to work, and they try to have resistance, because there is no friction, there is no stretching, there is no resistance to their muscles. And if they spend too much time, their muscles begin to degrade. And by the time they get into gravity where they actually need to use their muscles aren't working the way that they're supposed to work. And so it is in our spiritual life. If we aren't using faith, if God isn't stretching you in your life, maybe you're facing an impossible situation. Maybe you're just like Abraham this morning, and you have been waiting and it just is not coming to pass. Maybe God is stretching your faith this morning. But it is for us as we use our faith and we stretch it. But if God never makes us wait, how will we ever grow in our faith? Not only is waiting stretching our faith, many times, and Abraham finds us out, is that waiting shows the power of God in our life. James 5 and 10 says, brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Abraham learned patience. Abraham learned to wait. Abraham began to assume maybe this promise. In fact, at one point he even asked God, Lord, just bless Ishmael. Lord, just pour out your promise. Give your promise to Ishmael. Let it flow through him. I mean, it's been 25 years since he first heard from God. Now he's 99 years old, and God still hasn't fulfilled the promise he gave him. God gives Abraham, finally, the specifics of what he's going to do. He said, Abraham, Sarah, who is 90 years old, he said, you'll have a son by her. Abraham had waited for 25 years. He felt old when he began at 75. Now he's almost 100 years old. God hasn't fulfilled. His wife has progressed more and more. The older she gets, the more likely it seems that God's promise isn't going to be fulfilled. It seems like each day that passes, each year that passes, that God's promise wasn't going to be fulfilled in their life, but yet God made them wait to show them His power. As we wait, we obey. And as we obey, God reveals more in our life. Very rarely in my life has God revealed, well, now that I think about it, it's never happened. That God has revealed everything just immediately. How many of you, God has sat you down and He said, I'm going to reveal everything to you. And He's shown you a picture of every day of your life from now until death. Here it is. I'm going to lay it all out for you. No. What do you have to do? You have to wait. You have to walk in faith. You have to act in obedience every day, and God reveals a little bit more to your life each and every day. But first, you have to take that first step of obedience. You have to let God begin to stretch you. And then when you obey and you take that next step, God reveals a little bit more. And then you take another step in faith, and God reveals a little bit more in your life. See, God's not going to reveal everything into your life if you're not walking daily in obedience with Him. Abraham didn't give up. And we can't give up even when we don't understand. Habakkuk 2 and 3 says this. Out of the Message it says, but these things I plan won't happen right away. This is God speaking. Slowly, steadily, surely, the time approaches when the vision will be fulfilled. If it seems slow, do not despair, for these things will surely come to pass. Just be patient. They will not be overdue a single day. Be patient. God is right on time. 130th Psalm, verse 5 says, I pray to God my life a prayer and wait for what He'll say and do. Abraham had heard God's promises over and over. But as he continued to walk in obedience, God revealed a little bit more each time. In Genesis 12, God tells him, you're going to be a great nation. Okay, God, I'll act in obedience. Then in Genesis 13, He says, your descendants are going to be as numerous as the dust of the earth. And He says, okay, God, I'll walk in obedience. Then in Genesis 15, God reveals that the promise is going to be fulfilled through your son. And He says, okay, God, I'll walk in obedience. And then it wasn't until Genesis 17 that God says, and your son in whom it'll be fulfilled is Isaac. See, God didn't tell Abraham everything in the beginning. He told Abraham just enough so that He could get him on the right track and get him moving and get going in the direction that he wants to go. Some of us want to know everything right now. And if God doesn't tell you everything right now, you say, Lord, I'm not going to do it. Lord, you need to tell me, you need to show me, you need to give me exactly what I'm doing, where I'm going, what the plan is, everything. Because, Lord, I need to know, I need to have all that information. And God says, no, you don't. What I'm asking you to do is take one step of obedience. You take that step of obedience, and then we'll see what's next. Abraham acted in obedience, one step at a time. Not only did Abraham, in waiting on the promise, Abraham had to obey the promise. You know, it's not enough to know the promise of God. You have to begin to obey God's promises in your life. It's an act of obedience that takes place in verse 9 when God is speaking to Abraham, and He says, as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. He says, this is my covenant you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. The promise was that Abraham would receive the land of Canaan, and his offspring, his descendants, would receive it. Now God has attached to that promise an external act of obedience that he now has to fulfill, a symbol, an external act testifying to what God has promised in the spiritual realm. Abraham must now act in the physical realm in a covenant that God has established externally to show what God is doing internally. Isaiah 49:23 says, "You'll know then that I am God. No one who hopes in me ever regrets it." See, a symbol, an external act testifying to the faith that they had in God's promises, and he's never let them down. It's not about the outside, but it is about the inside. See, when God speaks to Abraham and he gives him this new act of obedience tied to the promises, tied to this covenant, this idea of circumcision, it wasn't that that was going to bring about the fruition of the promise. It was that is an outward act of obedience to show that you are believing and acting in obedience to the underlying promise. You see the difference? See, Moses had talked about it in Deuteronomy later when he says in 10:16, he says, "Circumcise your hearts, therefore, and do not be stiff-necked any longer." Romans 4:9, Paul sheds a little bit of light on it, and he says, is this blessing, talking about the promise, this blessing from God, is this blessing then only for the circumcised? Is Jesus only for the circumcised, or also for the uncircumcised? For we say that faith was counted to Abraham as righteousness. How then was it counted to him? Was it before or after he had been circumcised? If it was not after, but before, he was circumcised. See, circumcision was the outward sign of an inward work that God was doing. It was authenticated the righteousness by faith. See, Abraham was already counted righteous. It was already counted towards him. But God needed him to act in obedience to show that the covenant was still being maintained. All right, what does it have to do with us? Okay. God told Abraham, here is the promise, here is the covenant, here is what I'm giving you. Now, your outward, your physical now has to reflect what I'm doing on the inside of you. But sometimes as a church, we get that backwards. We think somebody needs to completely change their outside first. They need to fix themselves on the outside. They need to, don't come here if you're on drugs, or don't come here if you're wearing certain things. Don't come. We think we want to circumcise the outside before God circumcises the inside. Makes sense? See, it wasn't the circumcision that brought about the promise for Abraham, but that spiritual circumcision in our life that, this sounds crude and I'm sorry, but cuts away those things that are unpleasing to God in our life. It's not removing those things that are unpleasing to him, though, that makes us saved. It's acting in obedience to God and fulfilling the new covenant and following Jesus Christ, and removing of those things in our lives follows afterwards. It's our behavior. It's not our doctrine that demonstrates our faith in Jesus Christ. Symbols that profess of an inward work in our life. It's the same reason we don't believe that water baptism brings about salvation. We believe that water baptism is a symbol, an outward expression of what God has done on the inside. We work too often on our outside, and we let those things on the inside that are unpleasing to God continue to fester. We do what, see, this is where Israel began to get it backwards. They began to concentrate on the physical. They began to concentrate on the laws. They began to make those things the most important. They made circumcision the most important when that was never really God's purpose. Our outside truly changes only when we allow God to change us on the inside first. Seen people, I'm sure you've seen them too, that on the outside they look all put together. But on the inside their lives are a mess. God doesn't care about your outside. God cares about what's going on inside of you. Faith becomes useless if salvation is tied to that outward work.